Thank you again. We start the second part of today's session, this morning session. Now it's the turn for Marijn Koolen, and please.
Okay. Thank you. So first of all, thanks for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. So this is a summary of work over the past years that I've done with a bunch of colleagues on formulaic language and how it's used in historical corpora, and particularly the role that it plays in political and administrative corpora of all kinds of organizations, and how we can extract information from that. So to give a little bit of background and motivation, this started from a project called Republic, which we finished last year, in which we published the resolutions of the States General of the Dutch Republic. Now to explain that, the States General were the sort of central governing body of the Dutch Republic in this period 1576 to 1796. And over this 220 years, they had daily meetings and all kinds of stuff was brought to the table where they were meeting. And they made some 700,000 decisions over that period. And the guy to the left was the person who recorded everything in these big volumes that you see here. Most of them handwritten, but some of them have later been published in printed version. And that's what we worked on. So we published this in a digital environment, so you can do full text search. There's very rich metadata with which you can do all kinds of selection and further search. Let's see of this. And so the reason we got this rich metadata is that the text that they use is very formulaic. So here's a start of a resolution in Dutch. So the first line in English, has been heard the report of the gentleman, is a very formulaic expression that is an indication of here starts a resolution. If you go further in the book, you come across exactly the same line for a different resolution. It's not the only phrase that they use. They have a few hundred formulas that they use to introduce a resolution. Here's another one, has been read in the meeting, the petition of. And every resolution first has a proposition part, what was brought to the table, and then there's a decision part that almost always starts with the same formula over and over again. Now, why is this useful? If you know where these formulas appear in the page, you can actually segment your text, and instead of having text per page, you have text per resolution. So now you have access to the individual resolutions. But there's much more than that, because if you look at this example I just showed, first of all, this formula already reveals to you that there's a document submitted and it's a petition. So you have a type of document that's been archived, so you can potentially link to it later. And also it's always followed by who submitted that document, a little description of them and where they lived. So by just understanding this structure and using these formulas, you can already extract quite a lot of metadata on these individual resolutions. So this started us on this path of, okay, formulaic language, interesting phenomenon. Does it appear in other places as well? Can we find this in corpora and do other information extraction tasks related to this? And if so, where would we expect to find it? So our hunch was there's probably something to do with administrative records. So if you think about resolutions, ordinances, notarial deeds, these documents have legal consequences, so it really matters what is in them and how they are written, how they are formulated. So we started theorizing, okay, why would administration be very formulaic? Well, if you think about how records are created, they have a lot of repetitive processes doing the same task thousands, tens of thousands of times. And when you tend to do things tens of thousands of times, you develop kind of certain patterns. So you think about taking meetings and then process verbal, you have drafting all kinds of documents, handling all kinds of requests. This happens daily for a period of decades or centuries. And it really matters that they contain the right information to be valid or authoritative. They need to follow the ritual to be considered valid. So there's probably an implicit information model that a document or a record needs to follow. So you have a lot of these records that are probably very similar in content and structure. And so the advantage of using fixed phrases is you make sure that it has the meaning that you want it to have. It's much faster to create them because you don't have to think about how to phrase it. And it also helps information spotting. But over centuries, you have a massive archive and you need to look up information. If you know what the formula to look for, it's much easier to spot the information. So there's probably multiple reasons why this happens. And our idea is that this then leads to very repetitive text. Okay, so far the theory. So now the question is, are administrative corpora actually more repetitive than other corpora? So we want to do a comparative analysis. We have administrative and other domains, and we want to look at textual repetition. So a very simple experiment that we did is take a bunch of paragraphs from a corpus, a random selection, put them in a random order until we have 1 million words. We count word n-gram frequencies. In this case, sequences of 5 words, and we just keep track of how often they occur. And per 10,000 words, we see how big is our vocabulary of 5-word phrases. So there are nice measures to express this, vocabulary growth curves. So in our case, we say, well, if a 5-word phrase occurs 25 times in exactly that order, that's probably quite a good signal for a formula. It's a bit of an arbitrary choice, but it works. So we see at every n-grams that we've observed how many different phrases have we seen at least 25 times. So you can make these nice curves. We took 10 different corpora. The top 5 in the legend are all administrative. So we have notarial deeds. We have 2 books from the Swiss canton of Bern, police and mandate books. We have some medieval charters. We have the resolutions, and then 5 fairly randomly selected based on what I could easily get my hands on. Other domains, some modern, some historic Dutch. They're not all in Dutch, by the way. But we can see here clearly how many 5-word phrases occur at least 25 times as we go over its corpus. And so there's 3 that stand out. That's the notarial deeds, that's the charters and the resolutions. Now there's these 2 other administrative corpora that you don't see this rise. And that is probably because the text recognition rate has so many errors that every 5-word sequence has so many variations, so you never build up this frequency. But if you just look at the text themselves, you can already see the formulas jump out at you. So there's a very clear signal that this is what's going on. So we have repetitive text. Now we want to identify the actual formulas themselves. So how can we do that? So we have a very, again, relatively simplistic approach. We start from the same idea. We have these word n-grams, and we just count how often they occur. We want to take into account some word order variation. So sometimes word 1 appears before word 2, but sometimes it's the other way around. So we build a nice package for this to do this formula detection. But then there's also all kinds of spelling variations. So not only text recognition errors, but also just spelling variation in early modern languages, spelling changes that you want to take into account. So we have a package for that as well. And then we want to do boundary detection, because you find a 5-word phrase that occurs frequently, but that might be not the entire formula. So there might be something before it or after it that you want to detect. So can we look for extensions of these partial formulas? So just to show how this works, the idea is we tokenize the text, and then for every word we want to see, is this a candidate to be part of a formula? Now the idea is if a formula is frequent, then the word must be frequent, and not only that, it must also co-occur with its neighbors very frequently. We set a minimum threshold, and any word that doesn't meet that threshold, we replace it by a variable token, and now in between the variable token, you can have a potential formula. So we go back to our list of 5-word frequency or 5-word phrases that occur a lot. So the top one, and then we just look at words that follow it and how often do these words follow it. We get so-called transition probabilities, and we can just make a graph and see here we hit a variable token. So in between we have a couple of variant phrases, and now we have a full formula. So this is how we do it so far. So now there's an interesting thing. You can actually look where these formulas occur. You can plot this over time. And then we find this interesting pattern that for a lot of these formulas, there's a point where they start, and before that, there's nothing. And so the question is that because before that period, there was a different formula for the same thing, or there was no formula for it? It was either a new meaning, or the meaning was just expressed in various ways. So we want to see, can we trace the development of these formulas? Can we see that there's stable periods where they use the same formulas, and then there's a transition to a different set of formulas, for instance. So we use the technique from computational literary studies that Joris just talked about a lot, which is stylometric analysis. What we do is we take all the resolutions from 1 year, put them together and count the most frequent 3-word sequences, and then we compare all the years with each other. The lighter the color, the more similar 2 years are, the darker, the more dissimilar they are. So of course you have this light diagonal because a year is always very similar to itself. But you can see that surrounding years, it tends to be similar to those. But you also see sort of boxes, like there's certain transitions seem to be happening in there. So if you use a hierarchical clustering algorithm, you actually get a really neat clustering of periods, 14 different periods. And the nice thing is that there were 11 people over this entire period who did the recording of the resolutions, and we know exactly who they were and when they were active. If you overlay them, you actually see that they very often line up with these transitions. So the person recording had an influence on those formulas. Okay, so that is really nice. Then there's another interesting thing to see. If we again look at vocabulary growth, we see that the oldest period had the fewest formulas. And as the time progressed, they became more and more formulaic. So there's actually much more going on. It's not just that text is repetitive, but they tend to introduce more and more formulaic aspects of these resolutions. That calls up all kinds of questions. Why is this going on? What does that mean? So historians are fascinated by this, and they say, okay, so political historians say, it's almost like this became more like a decision-making machine. It's just an algorithm. You know, you submit your request, and it's dealt with in this particular way every single time. So that's an interesting thing. Why would that be happening? Is that maybe a form of technocracy increasing? So here's a thing that I often discuss with people who always start the discussion with, why didn't you just use LLMs? You know, you have your scans, you do a little ground truth set, annotate these scans and say, this is where something starts, and train a model and it will tell you the answer. Well, if you do that, you would never figure out that there's this thing going on with formulaic language that develops over time and that really means something and tells you something about these processes of historical administration. So there are definitely advantages to machine learning, but the disadvantage is that we learn very little. And so this is slightly controversial phrase maybe, but research is about human learning, not machine learning. So it's nice that we learn as well. Okay, to wrap up, so this is sort of a research agenda. We want to continue this work. We think that there's a lot more interesting stuff that can be done to improve the detection and the modeling of these formulas. So there's a couple of things that we struggle with, recognition errors, but also phrases that really mean the same thing, but are semantically or syntactically quite different. Maybe we can use embeddings in that sense that they are very good at capturing regularity in all kinds of variation, but we want to keep the rule-based aspect because it's very good at making explicit what knowledge is in there, and we can find these boundaries. And then, of course, we want to explore more what's going on in these administrative corpora. So what is the relation between the formulas that they use and the information models underlying these records? So it's very valuable for information extraction, but of course also for historical research, the development of these things. And if you look at these archives and corpora across the world, you probably find many similarities and dissimilarities that can tell you something about historical developments. So that's it.
Thank you very much.
Yes, yeah. So in this case, the resolutions are quite particular because they're extremely formulaic. But at some point they had what they called form books. And so they had an entire resolution written out with just dots for the variables that need to be filled in. And so you find that there are formulas to introduce a document that's been submitted, but also a formula that says this has been sent to the Department of Finance to accept this bill. And so, you know, if that's the formula, then we know what the resolution is about. So yeah, the more you know about the individual formulas, the more you can know about the topic, about specific processes that were applied. And so this is also very interesting because you can then add that as metadata, and people can now very easily say, I'm only interested in petitions, and just select those. So you get 80,000 petitions instead of 700,000 resolutions. So yeah, you can do a lot with knowing what the formulas are about.
There are many cases, but questions such as like laws or receiving constitutions or I don't know, graphic on which they let single time things in as business. And this also could be in a way that you can use the formulaic expressions to perform knowledge extraction and getting the single nodes of a sentence.
Well, I think so. I mean, I think that's really close to what we're already doing. So the example I showed at the beginning, where we know that this formula is always followed by a named entity who is the submitter of this proposal. If you think about catalogs of forms or questionnaires, you can do similar tricks. So talking with colleagues, we said, okay, you can think about textual formulas, you can think about visual formulas, like is there a signature or is there a particular stamp that will tell you something about the process that this document went through. But also structural formulas. So catalog have a very particular structure, where the place of a phrase in the catalog tells you what that phrase means or what type it is. So you can extend this, but in a way, I mean, it's also a sort of structure extraction for which these tasks have been going on for decades. But yeah, these things are linked. Yeah.
I have so many comments and questions about this.
Okay.
But I will be keep it short. First of all, you may know that there exists an XML vocabulary for the representation of legal and legislative documents that is called a commentoso, and it's a international standard, and it clearly uses a lot of topics about the distinction between actual content and formulaic things around it. And the distinction between the formula and the non-formula is very important. The second thing is that the birth of the formula comes from the robustness of the tradition that becomes basically what my predecessors also said, becomes a standard way of thinking, that becomes a template, that becomes an actual form in which I just fill in the various parts and so on. It's a very understandable process in which, since difference is meaning, it's not the documents that follow the formula that becomes interesting, but the documents that seem to follow the formula, except here and there and there and there, that becomes the interesting thing. So not only identifying the formulas, but the slight variations of the formula becomes the really meaningful documents, because they are the weird one, the strange one, the one that are. And so I was wondering if you would. The other thing is that formula are location specific in documents. They do not appear everywhere. Some formulas appear in the beginning, some in the middle, some in the end. And also understanding where the formulas appear would be very interesting to discover. Not just the five words, but the section in which the formula appears.
Yeah, I removed those slides from the presentation. We have the function and location. So where in the document it sits tells you something about the function of the formula. So there's an intriguing one. So this formula appears, I don't know, 400,000 times in the corpus, but there's a couple of variations that also appear a lot, and they seem to be used in very specific cases, but the phrase really means the same thing. But it's this particular phrase is only used in this context, and this particular phrase is used for all the other contexts. And so now we're wondering, what's going on? Because this is so consistent that it meant something to them, and we just don't know. So yeah, that is interesting. And a lot of this, if you look at medieval studies in charters, of course, they've been known about these formulas for a very long time. So goes back to papal history and etc. A lot of this is known. So the interesting thing is to look also where formulaic language starts to emerge, because apparently there the process becomes also, or the steps in the process become ritualized. Right? So that's also an interesting aspect to study. Where does it start and why?
And it didn't end. So the interesting thing of what you're doing is that it's not something of historical value. It's happening now. And
Absolutely.
thank you very much.
Okay.